All right. Well, I am thankful, so thankful that you guys are here and fought through the rain for this study. Just think, if the rapture happens now, we will all be raptured from at church, and everyone else will have to explain to Jesus why they weren't at church because they wanted to avoid the rain. But today we're going to cover 29 chapters, 10,000 words, over 10,000 words, almost 11,000 words in English. That's how much we're going to cover. But I hope to do it. My heart is that we're doing it this way for a particular reason. And the reason being is that all the other times that I've studied Job, or I've taught through Job, and you're going after round, going through the verses, explaining what they're saying, what it is that they seem to be articulating, it is easy to get lost in the totality because there's just so much stuff. But Lord willing, by going this fast, over 29 chapters today, what we'll be able to see is the totality of what they're levying against Job. Because what they're going to attack against Job, based on what he says here in chapter 3, what they're going to do is they're going to pile on one particular statement, one particular premise, and they're going to attack it from a couple of different angles, and then we will see how mean and nasty they get in trying to drive this one point home. So we start off with chapter 3. Now, if you remember in the first two chapters, we had those throne room scenes with the Lord and Satan. We have all these terrible judgments coming upon Job. He's being inflicted in all these different ways. And then his friends come in for 7 days and 7 nights. They do the best thing they do with the entire book. They just sit and they weep with Job. But after these 7 days and 7 nights, Job speaks first. And that's something that we always need to remember. We're going to just shred these friends up after a while, but we need to remember that Job speaks first. And as we get into these chapters that cover the rounds of arguments, I'd like to share a plan of action with you so you understand what I'm planning to do. Now, a verse-by-verse study of these chapters can seem very tedious, and that's for a reason. It's supposed to be. It's supposed to feel tedious. It's supposed to feel heavy. But what we will learn as we go through these various rounds of arguments, that often the three friends present a particular angle on a singular argument rather than present more and more nuanced arguments. And what they'll do is they work this one particular angle is that instead of giving more facts and more things for Job to think about, instead they just get uglier and meaner in the argument. Because eventually their desire is to win the argument rather than guide their friend to a right understanding of God. And therefore, and for the sake of time, we're going to compress and really summarize the arguments of the friends, but take a little bit more time when we get to the words of Job. Because at the very least, we know that Job reflects the heart of the righteous who is in pain. But I need to impress upon you a very important guiding principle now. As we look at the words of the friends, even the words of Job, and especially the words of Elihu that we'll get to next time, but take everything we're about to read with a grain of salt and only believe a verse that you see any of the friends say, even Job, if you can find biblical evidence elsewhere in the Scripture for the exact principle you think is there. As a personal rule of thumb, especially when I'm teaching, I do not ever quote anything that the three friends or Elihu says as doctrine. Because while some of the ideas will sound really, really good, they're all based on a faulty premise. They all believe that Job is guilty of secret sin. And because of that, because that is their root, you can't trust anything fully that comes out of it. Some of it will sound good. Much of it will be totally wrong, but it will sound good to us because their thoughts appeal to how we would do things if we were God. And that's the problem. All of it has a corruption angle on it. But that being said, Job will speak amiss as he struggles to understand and accept what the Lord has permitted in his life. But we can still learn so much from Job because the words of Job come from a hurting heart. And while we still should not rest all of our doctrinal understanding upon his words, what Job does do is speak to us clearly through the conduit of pain, through the conduit of suffering. And it gives us hope and comfort that if this righteous man struggles when he's in pain, then God surely understands that we will suffer when we are in pain too. Now, again, last time we were in the book, we watched the three friends. After 7 days and 7 nights, Job breaks his silence, and it's only after he speaks that the friends begin their words. But he starts off in chapter 3 cursing the day of his birth. He's so extreme at this point, but for good reason. He was like, I wish I'd never been born. I wish I'd never incurred any of this. He cries out loud that it would be better if he had just died in the womb, because then he would be resting with the Lord and not have experienced all of the pain that he has. Now, verse 17 through 19 gives us some interesting insight into what the understanding was in Job's day of what happens to you after you die. He says the wicked ceases from raging. So whatever this afterlife is, whatever Sheol, the grave, Abraham's bosom was not a thing at this point, most likely, if he's during the time of Abraham. But the idea is that when you die, then you go to a place where there's no more evil. The wicked no longer can rage. The weary are at rest. The prisoners are freed from the taskmaster. And here's the thing, verse 19, we're going to see this concept multiple times in Job. The small and the great are there. Now, this is going to be one of the areas that Job will struggle with. We'll see him mention it a couple times. He goes, it doesn't matter how good you are, and it doesn't matter how bad you are. In the end, you end up the same way. And that's going to be something he struggles with. So in verse 20 through 23, Job asks two questions. First, he asks, why is light given to him who suffers? Now, the word light means light, but it's used especially to refer to the light that comes off of stars, that reflected off of the moon and other heavenly bodies. So the word has the idea of luminance, a beautiful luminous light that is being used as an idiom for the gift of life that God gives to us. In verse 23, he asks the second question, why is light given to him whose way is hidden? Meaning, why is life given to one who can't see where he's going? Job can't see where this is going towards. He doesn't understand it. That's going to be a big part of his struggle. But then he says this, and I need you to really focus in on verse 23, the last part. And whom God has hedged in. Now, that statement that he says right there, that's what the friends pounce on. Because this is the first time that Job claims that God has done this to me. And while verse 23 here and Job 1:10 both have the same word hedge in English, they're not the same word in the Hebrew. So this isn't Job repeating the words of Satan. But what he's saying is that God has pinned me in. He's forced me into this box. He's put me here. As the chapter closes, Job says something that the friends should listen to and heed. He says, I groan when I see my food. My cries pour out like water. Later on in Job 6:3, he's going to finish this thought that he starts here, because he says later, my pain is great, therefore my words have been rashed. So he's admitting here, listen, I'm just crying out. I'm in so much pain. I'm not trying to disparage the reputation of God. But what we need to understand is that Job is hurting. This is how he feels when he's in pain. And if you ever had a moment of anger or pain where you said something you didn't really mean, you just needed to vent. You just needed to speak and just not contain it all on the inside. And this is what's going on with Job. He's not giving out fully fleshed out doctrinal thoughts. He's a guy in pain. He's trying to process all that has happened. And what he needs is his friends just to give him a little bit of grace to work some of this out. Don't hold all these words against me. Weep with me. Hold me. Tell me how sorry you are that all of this is happening to me. And then pray over me. Not at me, over me. Pray that God would comfort me. And that I would be able to hold fast to him. We will see Job say this exact thing later on in Job 6:14 when he says, the man in despair should receive kindness from his friends. That's what I need from you guys. In Job 16, he tells them, what sorry comforters are you all? If the roles would reverse, I could beat you down too, but I would strengthen you with my words. I would use my lips to lessen your pain. And then finally, just when he's just at the end of himself in Job 19, he looks at his friends and he goes, pity me, my friends. This is what Job needs. We need to be so aware that when someone brings us into their trust, that trust is sacred ground. Now, we are not called to be anyone's emotional dump truck. We are not. If someone refuses to walk towards God, it's not your job to make them feel better about their mess. And if I'm counseling somebody and they tell me the story 3 times, the exact same way, always wanting the same response for me to make them feel better in it, that's all I'm going to give you. And at that point, you're just using me as some kind of cathartic release so you feel better. So I feel worse and you feel better, but you get filled up on more grief and then you come back and dump it on me. That's not the way it's going to work. But at the same time, I understand that we are being invited into a relationship where we are to hold their hearts like our hearts, their secrets like our secrets. And here's the other thing to remember. We'll especially see this in the life of Elihu. You have to earn the right to speak into someone's life. I have to know that your heart is for me before I care at all what you think. And it is the height of selfishness and arrogance to force your opinion on someone with whom you have not earned that place. It may offend you, but I tell it often. You are free to share your opinion if I am free to ignore you. And if your feelings get all bent out of shape, if I don't take your advice, then keep your thoughts to yourself, because all that does is tell me is that you didn't care about me at all. You care about you, and you want to conform me to what you want. And if that offends you, I'm not too concerned, because those who love me understand that a statement like that is born out of scars that run deep. And if you love me, you would understand that. This is where Job is. He doesn't even understand the hornet's nest he kicked up. But then Eliphaz speaks. Now, we don't know for sure. It doesn't tell us, but it is likely that Eliphaz is the oldest of the three friends, which is why he speaks first and why he speaks the longest, except for Elihu. Elihu speaks longer than everybody else, almost more than them combined. But Eliphaz speaks first. And here we have the response of the friends to the allegation of Job in Job 3:23. So always remember that, right? Whom God has hedged in. Now, contrary to Elihu, who we'll see in chapter 32, these three friends have earned the right to speak in the life of Job. And that's why they're going to get so much time talking to him one by one. They spent 7 days and nights not doing anything except sitting with him and weeping. They have shown by their actions. They have put in the time. So Eliphaz speaks first, and his authority is his personal experience. I know. Now, he's going to say this a couple of times. I have seen, I have observed, I understand this to be true. Now, what we need to see is that he's going to present, I know that the wicked suffer. That's his thought process. That's the premise he's going to work on. For them, for the three friends, their worldview is that good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people, ergo, if bad things are happening to Job, Job must be a sinner. Now, Job will reveal this in 6:21 when he tells the friends that you're like caravans in the wilderness looking for water, and you're going to where the wadi is, where the riverbed is, and you're expecting to find water there, but you show up and it's dry, and now you're all confused and confounded. He's saying this is what you expected to find. You expected to find this particular thing, and now you have seen something else, and you're confused, and therefore you are terrified. You tremble. That's what he's going to say to him later on. See, this is their problem. They need Job to be guilty. Because if Job is not guilty and he's suffering, that means we could suffer too. They can't use their good deeds like a lucky rabbit's foot to keep bad things away, a charm to keep those things away. If it can happen to Job and he's not a sinner, then it can happen to anyone. And they can't stand that, so they desperately need a world where we can avoid bad things happening by not doing bad things. Now, we should have sympathy for these three friends, because let's be honest, this is often how we look at the world. If something bad happens to someone, we're going to ask ourselves at some point, well, what did they do? Now, Eliphaz starts off with a very soft insult to Job. If I speak, will you become impatient? If I say something, are you going to bite my head off? You say you believe in God, but we all know, right? We all know the innocent are never perished. The upright are never destroyed. Now, already we start to see flaws in his argument. Job is just going to poke these apart later on. But verse 8 shows Eliphaz's premise. According to what I have seen, those who plant sin harvest trouble. Now, we will see this as a biblical concept later on, right? Those who sow will reap. What a man sows, so he will reap. Why? Because God is not mocked. We'll see that in Galatians. Now, he goes from this premise, and then in verse 12, Eliphaz suddenly gets all weird. And he gets almost like hyper-spiritual. He claims that a spirit came to him and said. Now, we don't know what's going on with Eliphaz, but what we do see in Eliphaz is a corruption of things that he believes in. Now, he says the spirit comes to him and he says, can mankind be just before God? If God even charges the angels with error. Now, this is one of the things that once you kind of see it, maybe you have a hard time not seeing it, and it is my personal suppositions I'm reading into it. But when I see this, when he talks about charging angels with error, and he will mention it again in Job chapter 15, these almost feel like words that Satan would say about God. How can you trust a God who even says his angels are wrong, who puts charge or error even on them? And I'm not saying at all that Eliphaz is possessed, but it seems like there's this demonic spirit speaking in his ears, almost as though this is part of the trial upon Job, that Satan is allowed to turn his friends against him by speaking these words into their ear. And he's taking this influence to turn around, to try to beat down Job, to try to get Job to blaspheme the name of the Lord. Chapter 5, Eliphaz keeps speaking. He says, Job's acting foolish. But if Eliphaz were Job, then I would do better. Because I would seek God, like Job isn't seeking God. Verse 11, God sits on high. And Eliphaz is trying to persuade Job to repent, to be humble to this instruction. Verse 12, God resists the unrighteous. Verse 17, but happy is the man who God corrects. Just like he's correcting Job, you should be happy about this, Job, because God will restore you and will give you great blessings. And then verse 27, Eliphaz is all proud of himself. He declares, the matter is closed. Behold, this we have investigated, and so it is. Hear it and know for yourself. Now, in chapter 6, Job begins his first response. Now, this starts a courtroom scene where Job is being questioned and he's allowed to counter-examine or present his argument. And we'll see it all the way until the very end in our last chapter today where he almost kind of has this moment where he goes, and I rest my case. Right, so these are courtroom drama unfolding before us, and he responds to the series of allegations. And he says, and remember the assertion of Eliphaz is that only the guilty suffer, therefore Job should repent. That becomes the center premise. All the friends are going to circle around it. Job starts off his response by admitting that due to the incredible weight of his pain, verse 2, my grief is like if the sand could be weighed, wet sand. Because of that, because of my grief, because of my pain, verse 3, my words have been rash. He understands that his words are coming out because of his pain. And he's speaking out maybe a little bit zealously because of how much he's hurting. But then he says this in verse 5. He goes, does an animal whine about their food? No. So if I'm complaining, doesn't that mean that something's wrong? Would I complain for no reason at all? Verse 8, oh, that God would end my pain and strike me down. It's that real. Verse 10, but this is my consolation, that in the midst of my pain, I have not denied the words of the Holy One. Now, when it says the words of the Holy One, we're not totally sure what that means. Now, here's the fun of Job. The Bible is accurate, but it is not always true. Meaning that the Bible tells us what happened, but everything that everyone says in it doesn't always say a true statement. There'll be falsehoods and lies that people are saying. And when we get to a book like Job that is grouped here in the poetry section, there's going to be some dramatic license in order to convey the thoughts that Job is saying out loud. And when it says this phrase, the words of the Holy One, we're not totally sure what that means. Because again, these events that are being recorded here may be the oldest recorded events except for the first 11 books of Genesis in the Bible. So these are later people recording what happened there at that time. So they're putting it in their current language in order to document this case. So when it says the words of the Holy One, we go, oh, well, that means the Bible. It probably doesn't mean the Bible because there was no Bible written at that time. But the idea seems to be that he has not denied the commands of God or the expectation that God has already revealed through himself that we see with Adam and Eve and later on with the boys in Cain and Abel. Verse 11, Job admits that he's exhausted. But what they should have done, verse 14, is you should have been kind to me. You should have lifted me up. Instead, and this is my interlude, this is Anthony speaking, what the friends did was they introduced a wall between Job and the Lord. Pastor Damian Kyle puts it this way. He goes, you can do nothing worse than to a child of God than to increase the distance between the Christian and the source of his hope. It is the most cruel thing you can possibly do. It's to convince that person God's actually further away from you than you think. And that's what they do. Verse 15, Job tells them that they're acting selfishly, expecting one thing, seeing another. They expect only the guilty to suffer, and so they need Job to admit secret sin so that they feel better about their lives. And that is the truth of their heartbeat behind the premise that they give. They keep saying only the wicked suffer, but it's because they're terrified that that's not true. Verse 22, did I ask for something hard from you? I mean, is it that tough to just be kind to your bud? Verse 23, do you intend to pick apart my words, knowing that the words of one who's in despair, one who is in pain, belongs to the wind? Just let me talk for a minute. Have you ever said anything that you didn't mean because you were upset and in pain? Would you want me to hold those words against you? Why can't you just let me talk for a second? Verse 28, therefore look at me. See if I'm lying to you. In chapter 7, Job is still speaking to Eliphaz and to the friends. He relates that all life is hard. It's short for all people, but especially for me. Therefore, verse 11, Job will not restrain his mouth. But then Job starts to levy his complaint against God. Now, we need to have buckets upon buckets of grace for Job. But at the same time, understand, the words of Job are not perfect either. The great benefit of studying the words of Job is that it gives us comfort that even the most wonderful of saints will have moments of struggle and doubt. It's the same reason we have that moment with John the Baptist when he's in prison. He has his own doubts about Jesus. He's known Jesus from the womb. And yet he sends messengers to go to him and go, are you the Messiah? Or are we looking for someone else? It's why we're allowed to see that moment in the garden with Jesus when he's so overcome with just the pressure of what is about to befall him, and he just kind of collapses and falls on the ground, and blood is being mixed with the sweat as it comes from his body. This is why we're allowed to see this moment with Job to give us hope. And so when we see the beginning of Job beginning to speak directly to God, give him some grace, but also don't hang your theology on his words. And he asked God, am I some kind of monstrous beast that you had to do this? That you had to set a guard over me and pen me in? Verse 17, what is man that you would even be so concerned about him, that you had to scrutinize his every single move? Verse 20, how have I sinned? What have I done? Verse 21, what have I done that is so bad that you won't forgive a nobody like me? In chapter 8, Bildad speaks next. Now, Bildad comes out of the gate swinging, and he asks Job if the Lord perverts justice. Or, verse 4, if your kids are gone, then doesn't that mean that they sinned against God? Now, this is totally untrue and unbelievably hard-hearted. It just hits Job right in the heart. Remember, Job did not collapse. He didn't rend his clothes until he heard what had happened to his kids. Not his stuff, not his house, not his wealth, but his kids. Verse 5, if you were pure, then God would defend you. So ask the past generations, verse 8, for we have only been here a little while. Now here comes Bildad's angle at the beginning. Eliphaz was I know, I have seen. Bildad is everyone knows. Go and ask anybody you want. Go all the way back. Everybody knows this to be true. That where there's smoke, there's fire. And the godless are the ones who are struck down. Verse 14 through 18, Bildad describes the fragile condition of the wicked. Verse 19, he tells Job that the Lord will not reject a man of integrity. Meaning, if you will admit your sin, God will take you back. He will fill your life with laughter, and he will put those who hate you to shame. So again, the same idea. You have secret sin, but if you repent, God will restore you. Chapter 9, now Job responds to Bildad. Again, we're in the courtroom scene. One attack comes, one accusation comes, and he responds to it. Verse 1 through 10, Job agrees that God will not reject a man of integrity, but here's the problem. I am. I'm being honest with you. He never says that he's perfect. What he's saying is that he's not guilty of secret, unrepentant sin. And Job's problem is he doesn't feel like he has a way to approach God. For one, this is the God who created everything. And how can the creation go to the Creator with a complaint? Throughout these verses, Job is going to use the observable universe as a way to try to understand an ununderstandable God. We will see it near the end of Elihu as well. as he goes on this long tirade about how God is like the storm and you can't understand the storm. How are you going to understand God? This kind of thing. But what we see here in the life of Job is a sanctified idea of natural law. What Paul describes in Romans 1:20, that the visible universe declares the invisible attributes of God. Even creation tells you about him. Also note in verse 9, Job is going to reference 3 constellations. God is going to reference these exact 3 constellations in Job 38, verses 31 through 32, which tells us that God is listening to all of this. And he's going to reach Job in the exact same language that Job is using here. Verse 11, God is so far beyond me that even if he did respond to me, I wouldn't believe he was talking to me. Verse 19, I can't approach him on the basis of power, meaning I can't make him show up. I can't summon him like he needed to appear before me in court. I am guiltless. I do not consider myself as something important, and yet it doesn't matter because it feels like to me that God destroys the guilty and the innocent alike. Indeed, the whole world is given over to the wicked, and if he didn't do it, then who did? Now, these words and statements are very powerful because these are things and concepts we all struggle with. We all struggle with the fact that sometimes it feels like the wicked get away with it. We see it later on in the Psalms of Asaph where he's just struggling with it. Lord, this is tripping me up. But because of his pain, Job is brave enough to say on the outside what we often think on the inside. Verse 25, Job feels so helpless in this because he feels like even if he said he was a sinner, I don't feel like God would ease up on me. Then verse 32, God is not a man that I may respond to him. And I feel like I have no intercessor to speak on my behalf. Listen to the pain of that statement and rejoice that we live when we do, because there is one thing that we have that Job does not, and that is a clear understanding of Jesus, who makes constant intercession for us. Chapter 10, Job keeps responding to Bildad's accusation. He says, I will say to God, let me know why you contend with me. Verse 3, you, Lord, are not a man who needs to search me to know if I'm guilty. Right? You already know all things. Elihu will actually use this as the argument against Job later on. God doesn't have to investigate you to see if you're guilty. He already knows who you are. He says, you are God, and you know, verse 7, that I am not guilty. And even though you know that, no deliverance comes. Verse 8, remember that you created me. Remember that you used to treat me kindly. You remember these things, I know. Verse 13, he says, I know you have placed these inside of you. You've hidden them in your heart. If I'm wicked, then woe to me. But even though I am righteous, I feel like you won't stop hunting me. Verse 20, so why won't you just leave me alone? Verse 11, following this cry, Zophar speaks. Now, he's the third of the 3 friends. He completes the angle of attack on Job. Okay, remember, Eliphaz's platform was, I know. Bildad's angle was, everyone knows. And Zophar's angle is, God knows, and you know how wicked you really are. Verse 6 shows the stinging heart of Zophar for Job, where he says, God has actually overlooked how wicked you really are. He has forgotten a part of your iniquity. You actually deserve worse. It is an unbelievably unfeeling response that is so vicious that if God does not specifically tell us that Zophar was one of Job's friends, I wouldn't believe it. But this shows the great error of arguments like this, because the friends have switched totally from trying to comfort Job to try to beat him down because they desperately need him to be wicked so that their worldview makes sense. Verse 13, therefore, if you will reject your heart to what is right, verse 13, if you will repent and spread out your hands to the Lord, then he will restore you, and your life will be brighter than the noonday. In chapter 12, Job responds to Zophar. And Job discusses the worldview of the friends, that you only suffer if you're wicked. But first, he starts to throw some jabs at him because he's starting to get a little bit lit up. He goes, verse 2, surely you are the guys. You are the guys. Wisdom will die with you. But then look at verse 3. I have a brain, just like you guys do. Surely, who does not know these things? Now, here's the understanding of the time. Job believes also the exact same thing that they believe, that only the wicked suffer, the righteous are delivered. He says it later on again, and we're like, Job, you just spent something like 20 chapters arguing against this. See, here's the problem. He goes, I know this is true, but my situation doesn't fit it. It doesn't make sense. I'm one who cried out to God and was heard. And now I'm a joke to my friends. And I love how he says this, how he describes this kind of heart of being crying out to the Lord. Verse 4, the one who called on God and he answered him. And I understand it because I know what it's like to cry out to God and know that he hears you. It changes everything about your prayer life at that moment. You will never pray the same way. And he goes, so this doesn't make sense to me. Because I know what it's like to pray to a living God. Maybe this wicked will suffer idea makes sense in a general application, but it doesn't seem to apply to me, and that's why I'm so confused. The accepted thought of the time is that only the wicked suffer, but as Job will point out in verse 5 and 6, we can see with our own eyeballs the tents of the destroyers prosper, and those who provoke God are secure. And because God is all-powerful, this has to be an extension of his will. Now, this is big-time theological stuff. People struggle with this to this day. But look at what he does in verse 14 through 25. And Job says this about God, showing the complete control of God. He tears down, he restrains. He sends out, he makes. He loosens, he makes, he deprives, he pours, he reveals, he makes, he deprives, he makes. All of these last verses show a complete dominance by God to do anything that he wants. And then he looks at his friends and he goes, now you explain to me how this works. In chapter 13, Job goes, I know you guys don't have an answer to this. I don't have an answer for this. So verse 3, I'd rather just talk to God for a while if you don't mind, because you speak unjustly for him. Verse 5, he wishes out loud, I wish you guys would take your own advice. And then in verse 9, he flips the scripts on them and he goes, how well would it be with you if you were examined by God? Now we're going to learn the answer to that in Job 42:7. When God turns his attention to the three friends, he is not going to be pleased with them. But in verse 13, he goes, you know what? Just be quiet. I want to address and speak to God for a little bit. In verse 14, Job admits that because God is, even though God is more than capable of squashing him, verse 15, God is Job's only hope. Now, we will see this multiple times in Job's speech where he goes, you know what? I know I'm taking my own life into my hands by daring to speak to the living God. But I have to. Because I was hoping my friends would comfort me and give me hope, and they're clearly not. I've lost everything else. I can't even turn to my wife. My only hope is God. Therefore, verse 15, even if God slays me, still I will trust him. I will hope in him. Starting in verse 18, Job begins his presentation before the Lord, directly to the Lord. Now, he hasn't done this yet. He's cried out to the Lord, but this is the first time we had this formal declaration to God. We saw bits of this in chapter 7. We saw bits of it in chapter 10. But what we see here that he presents to God is this repeated heart of Job that causes us to say that the real deep need in the heart of Job is not to know why. He's going to ask that a lot, but that's not his deepest need. And it's not really to get God to stop. And we saw that in chapter 1 and 2. When it did happen to him and he didn't know why, what does he say? The Lord gives and the Lord takes away, but blessed be the name of the Lord. But the deep need of the heart of Job is what we see here and repeated throughout when we get to it, is where is God when I hurt? Where is God when I cry? And we will see this exact cry in verse 24 in this chapter when Job asked the Lord, why do you hide your face from me? In chapter 14, Job admits man is weak, his days are short. He's like a flower that fades, a shadow that does not remain. It is beautiful. It is such poetic language. Verse 6 through 14, he goes, if you don't remove your gaze from me, I'm going to be consumed. And sure, you can cut down a tree, and the tree stump will eventually start to show signs of life. But that won't happen with the man. So if you knock me completely down, there won't be any Job left. When you eventually miss me, verse 15. In chapter 15, Eliphaz speaks. Now, this is round 2. Remember, he was the first friend to speak. And he accuses Job of allowing his guilt, verse 5 of chapter 15. You're using your guilt to shape your speech. Now, earlier, what did Job say? No, my grief shapes my speech. Because my pain is so much heavier than the wet sands of the sea. Therefore, my speech is rash. He goes, no. You're saying what you're saying because you know you're guilty. Verse 7, Eliphaz asked Job if Job has secret knowledge that would allow him to reject the path of returning to God that everyone knows to be true, again, according to them. I think it's funny he's saying this because he's the one who claimed to have secret knowledge from a spirit that came to him. So if Job does not have secret knowledge, verse 12, why does his heart cause him to turn against God? Verse 13. Again, Eliphaz describes how worthless man is. And if God does not even respect his angels, now there's that same idea again. Almost this like grudge being born against God for not considering his angels so great. But if God does not even respect his angels, how much less is man? So Eliphaz will set Job straight. He tells Job that I tell you what I know. Again, this is what I know. I know that the wicked suffer. I know what wise men have been saying. And here's the wisdom of all wise men, according to Eliphaz in verse 20. The wicked man writhes in pain all his days. Because, verse 20, the wicked has stretched out his hand against God and conducted himself arrogantly against the Almighty. Chapter 16, Job now responds to the latest argument of Eliphaz. He tells the friends, guys, you guys are terrible at this. I hope this isn't your day job because you stink at being encouragers. You know what? If the roles were reversed, I could beat you down with words too, but I would strengthen you with my words. I would use my speech to lessen your pain. Verse 6, Job admits that speaking doesn't lessen my pain, but I need to voice it. I need to get it out. In verses 6 through 17, he describes his condition. This is why I can't keep the words on the inside. Verse 18, Job cries out, is there anyone who will listen to my pain? For my friends are scoffers, and my only advocate is in heaven far away. Again, there's that feeling of distance and loneliness. Verse 21, oh, if God was only nearby. If only he was next door so I could plead with him up close. Again, the constant refrain in Job's heart is that he can't seem to find God. He confessed in chapter 1 and chapter 2, right? He's okay with not always understanding why. He trusts the Lord, but the deep pain of his heart is that when he cries out, no one seems to be listening. In chapter 17, Job starts off that chapter by saying, is there anyone who will be a guarantor for me? The idea is that I'm trying to take out this loan that I'm really innocent, that I am righteous, I'm not hiding secret sin. Will anybody co-sign this loan, this pledge with me that I'm not hiding secret sin? Verse 6, Job feels like the Lord has made Job a byword. He's a proverb. He's a negative example. He's a story you tell about what not to do. As Job said in verse 5, God has blinded everyone's eyes from seeing the truth about him. Nevertheless, verse 9, the righteous will not give up. Now, I love this about Job. He's starting to get his energy back. He's getting a second wind. So verse 10, come on, bring it on, you bunch of wimps. I don't see a wise man among you. For where is my hope? It's definitely not with you guys, so let's keep fighting. And we will go down to the grave together. Verse 16. Chapter 18, Bildad comes up to the plate again, and he speaks for the second round. Now, understand that the arguments of the friends are not going to get more advanced. Nobody goes, well, I have this argument I've been holding on to spring it on you. Instead, they're just going to get meaner and more simple because they really don't have anything new to say. So they're going to keep pushing the ideas that the wicked are always judged. Therefore, Job is clearly wicked. For Bildad, his entire argument in this chapter is in verse 5 and 21. Verse 5, indeed, the light of the wicked always goes out. In verse 21, the house of the wicked will always end up scattered and dried up. Chapter 19, Job responds to Bildad by saying that so many times you guys have insulted me. But if I'm making a mistake, I'm only hurting me. If I'm wrong about this, how does it hurt you guys? In verse 5, Job begins a thought that he will complete in verse 28 and 29. In verse 5, he starts to warn his friends that if you try to vaunt yourself, that means if you try to puff yourselves up so you can get ready to attack me, then no, I'm the one that was wronged. That's not exactly true, but that's how Job feels. But the end of the warning is this. Verse 5 says, don't puff yourselves up. Verse 28 and 29 says, and if you're trying to figure out how to attack me, then beware for yourselves, for wrath brings punishment. He understands they have no desire to comfort him anymore. And they're not even trying to get him to see the truth. They're angry at Job now. They need him to be wrong. And he goes, watch out, because wrath brings punishment. Verse 21, but what Job wants is not their destruction. Because you guys want to beat me down. Verse 21, what I want is your pity. Pity me, oh my friends. Why do you persecute me as the Lord does? Are you not satisfied with my flesh? It is this callousness of the friends that causes Job to cry out in verse 23, oh, that my words were written down. Oh, that they were engraved on a rock. The idea seems to be that Job feels like his words are being ignored. He's speaking them out and they're just being blown away. And he wants them recording, hoping that somebody will pay attention. Someone will walk across and just listen to his cry. Now, this is the fun and the difficulty of poetry. Reading verses like this allow a little bit of interpretation on our part because we can't hear his voice or see his expression. But when I look at these, this is what it feels like to me. This is what he's crying out. Will someone just listen to what I have to say? But one thing that is not open to interpretation is verse 25, that even in the midst of this, Job is holding on to God. As for me, I know that my Redeemer lives, and that before the end, he will take his stand on the earth. Now, that idea of taking his stand on the earth, again, is a courtroom term. They're in a courtroom scene here. And because he says at the beginning, my Redeemer, the idea is I know before the end, God will take his place on the stand, and he will testify on my behalf. He will tell everyone who's against me that I am indeed innocent of secret sin. And this is the incredible wisdom of Job. For while we can't build our doctrine on everything that he says, we can learn so much from what he does and why he does it. Because all of Job's life declares the wisdom that when I run into what I don't know, I fall back on what I do know. And that's what he does. I don't understand everything that's going on, but I know this. Somehow, God is still on my side. Chapter 20, Zophar speaks. And like Bildad, he's going to offer this oversimplified idea that everyone knows from days of old. Verse 5, the victory of the wicked is short because verse 29, God only gives the wicked destruction and darkness. In chapter 21, Job tells his friends, listen, let me talk, and then you guys can mock me. You can make fun of me again in a second. But first I want you to look at me, verse 4 through 6. Really look at me. Be shocked when you look at me. Remember his condition here. Where he is covered head to toes in boils. He's having to scrape them with broken pieces of pottery. So undoubtedly his skin is all scarred up and covered in scabs. He goes, even I'm disturbed when I realize the horror that has taken hold of my flesh. I haven't grown used to this. It still shocks me. And now look at the wicked, verses 7 through 12. The wicked still live. They continue on. They're not judged, not like this. But maybe you might say, verse 19, oh, God is waiting to pour out judgment on the wicked man's kids. Elihu is going to say this later on. Who are you to tell God when he's to judge? He goes, but Job's point is that's not righteous. Now, we know from Deuteronomy 24, in verse 19, he adds onto it that maybe he's planning on pouring this judgment out on the people's kids. But Job goes, that's not righteous. And we know from Deuteronomy 24 that God will say that the kids will not pay for the sins of their parents and the parents will not pay for the sins of their kids. And even before the law, Job knows that this is a ridiculous punishment for the wicked. Oh, I'm not going to do it on your life. I'm going to do it on your kid's life. He goes, what does it matter? They're wicked. Why are the wicked suddenly going to start caring about their kids? That's the whole point. In verse 22, Job asks, can anyone teach knowledge to God? Can anyone tell him what to do? And yet we see it with our own eyes. One person dies full of strength. Another dies and they never even tasted anything good. And yet they both end up in the dust. So you guys tell me, how is any of that fair? Verse 27, now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, the wicked will get what they're due someday, but that's not what you said. He said, you said they get judged right away. Everybody knows this. And what do we see about the wicked? They go to their grave and they're being carried in honor. Men watch over their tombs to make sure that no one defiles it. The dirt covers them gently, and everyone ends up the exact same way. So how will you comfort me, since all your answers are untrue? In chapter 22, Eliphaz speaks for the third and final time. He's reached the end of his wit. So now he's going to go into full-blown attack mode. This is his last play. To start, Eliphaz gives Job an inverse of what Satan said in Job 1:9. Now, again, I admit to you, maybe I'm just reading into this because my head kind of seizes with Eliphaz. But he sure speaks a lot of the words of Satan. And in Job 1:9, Satan asked God, does Job fear God for nothing? And here Eliphaz takes that same idea and he flips it around on Job and he goes, does God punish Job for nothing? Is not your wickedness great? Is not your iniquity without end? Then Eliphaz just starts to accuse Job of one sin after another. And all of them are untrue because God himself said in chapter 1 and chapter 2 that Job is not guilty of these things. Verse 12 through 14, the reason why you're so wicked, Job, is because you said to yourself, oh, God is far away. What does he know about what I'm doing down here? Does not the clouds cover me so that he can't see what I'm doing? Verse 15, do you insist on walking in the ancient paths which the wicked walked? Do you say to yourself, but the wicked get such good stuff? No, instead you should yield. Stop fighting God, and you will be restored if you return to him, verse 23. For the humble person, the Lord will say, verse 29, and then look at verse 30, he will even rescue a guilty man like you. In chapter 23, Job responds to Eliphaz. This is the third time. And he really doesn't want to talk to other friends anymore. The accusation of Eliphaz is so ugly and wrong. And so he just starts crying out. It says, that I knew where I might find the Lord, that I might come to a seat. Would he answer with me? Would he really struggle with me in an argument? Of course not. But at least he would remember that I exist. It is this chapter of Job that most captures the pain of Job's heart. Again, we know from the beginning that the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Job is fine with that. It hurts, but that's not Job's problem. Job's great struggle is, where is God? And that's why verses 8 through 10 have maybe the most famous verses in all of Job. When he says, behold, I go forward, and he is not there. And backwards, but I can't see him. He moves on the left, but I cannot behold him. He turns on the right, and I still can't see. But even though I cannot see him, I know that he sees me. And this is why this book has to come after Esther in the canon. This is why we have to see that lesson in Esther first. Because all of Esther says the same thing. Even when you can't see God, God is on the move. And this is what Job most desperately needs. Even when I can't see God, God sees me. And when he has tried me and he tests me, he knows I will come forth as gold. Verse 11, Job again confirms his innocence of this list of sins. Verse 13, he confesses that no one can just run up on God. But still I am not silenced by the darkness, by the confusion or the despair that covers my life. Chapter 24 starts off with verse 1. Verse 1 is a very odd verse to translate. It seems to have idioms within it from the Hebrew that nobody knows what they actually mean. Talking about, what is this about? Are not times stored up by the Almighty? What is he talking about? The idea seems to be when it talks about times, other places put like legal times or appointment times or times of judgment. It appears to be times that God will judge or what his plan for judgment is. And the idea is almost, why doesn't God just keep regular business hours so we know where to find him when we need him? The latter part of verse 1 confirms this kind of interpretation, for Job is asking, why does God keep those he loves in the dark? Why not just tell us what he's doing? Why not just tell us what he's doing and when he's doing it so that we would understand? Verse 2 through 17, Job describes those who are wicked. Verse 18, he describes the non-impression the wicked make on the world. Verse 22, but then God drags away the proud and the strong. Sure, they're exalted, but then they're cut down. So somebody tells me what this means. The wicked are not always peaceful, and they're not always judged. And that's the confusion I'm having. Now, no, in verse 22, it might say the valiant or the mighty, depending on your translation. the word appears to refer to just strength, but also to a strength that is independent or opposed to God. And it's just nebulous enough that we're not sure exactly what it is. It seems to be a reference to the wicked, but it could just as easily be a reference to one who is strong. So the context of the passage seems to lean towards the former, that one who has puffed themselves up, God takes them down. Chapter 25, Bildad speaks. Now, this is going to be the last of the three friends that speak against Job. Zophar isn't going to say anything else in this last round. And here's his argument. God is good, man is bad. And that's the argument. That is the entirety of the argument. Now, chapter 26. In chapter 26, Job looks at Bildad after that extremely eloquent speech, and he goes, wow, you guys are good. I mean, what a help you are to one who's without strength. Verse 5, Job declares he knows that God is beyond our understanding. He's beyond our imagination. He's the one before whom even the grave stands naked. He's the one who stretches out the north over empty space. He hangs the earth on nothing. He wraps up water in the clouds. He inscribed a circle on the surface of the water. Now, these statements are all statements, they're scientific statements that point to an understanding of the true nature and form of the earth, possibly from a time when the people still thought the earth was flat and rode around on the back of a giant turtle. But they understand this because even creation declares the character of God. Job gives his conclusion in verse 14, and even what we see, even the elements of creation that are before us that we can see with our eyeballs, even those are only the edges, the fringe of his ways. The idea is the end of your robe where it starts to unravel. That's how all we can see. What we hear is just a whisper of his majesty. Who could understand it if they heard the thunder of his glory? Chapter 27. In this chapter, Job completely rejects the assertion of his friends that Job has been hiding secret sin. Verse 5 and 6, he goes, far be it from me that I should say you guys are right. Till I die, I will hold fast to my righteousness, and I will not let it go. Verse 7, how can I be wicked when I keep crying out to God? Does that make any sense to you guys? Verse 11, Job declares he'll instruct his friends, and then proceeds to say the exact same thing the friends have been saying about the wicked, that they'll all be judged. But this is actually important, because what this does is it confirms that Job believes that God expects that those who love him, they should be righteous. And we'll see this in Job 28:28. But what Job is saying in the next chapter is, how does any of this make sense? Now, this is something that Elihu is going to accuse him of, and we see here that Job says, no, that's not true. Because Elihu is going to accuse Job of saying, what's the point of being righteous? That's never what Job says. He never says, what's the point? He's saying, I don't see a difference in how God treats us, because I don't understand how this is happening to me. But what he's saying is, I'm not guilty of a secret life of unrepentant sin. And I know that the wicked will be punished. I know that God expects his people to be righteous. But what I don't have is the wisdom. Well, why one who is not wicked, appears to be receiving their due. Now, he doesn't talk about that wisdom till the next chapter. But remember, there's no initial chapter breaks in the original text. So he goes from this place of going, this is how the wicked, this is what we understand. But you know what I don't have? I don't have the wisdom of chapter 28 to understand why this is happening to me. Job says that for everything that is valuable in the beginning of chapter 28, for everything that is valuable, there's a mine, there's a way to refine it and get it from the earth. But what is most valuable, wisdom, who can find it? Men cannot search it out. You can't find it in the rocks. I love verse 7. It says, birds of prey cannot find its path. The idea is of hawks and eagles flying up and looking down, and they seem to see everything. They see a tiny squirrel hiding under a branch, but they can't seem to find the path that will lead you to wisdom. Proud beasts haven't just walked across it. Indeed, man can dam up whole rivers, but where can wisdom be found? Verse 13, man as a whole doesn't even understand its value. And where it is hidden from his eyes. Verse 23, God alone understands wisdom. And while God understands the fullness of wisdom, in his wisdom, he chooses to share only one thing. The fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. This is the brilliance of God, the timelessness of his message. Because who knows how many years before Solomon, God declares the wisdom of Proverbs 9:10 here in the book of Job. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. And Job says God has chosen not to give us wisdom to understand all these other things. But the one thing he has told us is this: fear him. That's the beginning of wisdom. Depart from evil, and you will understand. In chapter 29, Job begins his final argument. Again, courtroom scene. This is his summation. This is everything. He's really talking to the Lord, not so much to his friends at all anymore. But Job begins by relating how his life used to be. Now, this is important. It tells us what his life was like. It acts as a contrast so that the jury will know, if you will, the jury will know all that Job has lost. I was loved. I was respected. But chapter 30, but now I am rejected by fools. I am rejected by people whose dads I wouldn't let hang out with my dogs. I mean, these are fools that don't even have a name. They're not known for anything. They were driven from the land, and now I have become their taunt, their running joke. I cried out for your help, but you, O Lord, did not answer me. Verse 24, and yet even now I cry out to you, because doesn't even one who is dying on a pile of rocks, don't they still stretch out their hand? So let me ask you this, O Lord. Verse 25, did I laugh when someone was suffering? Did I not grieve for those who are in need? And yet now I am the one who is suffering. I am the one who is in need. And when I asked for help, hoping that someone would treat me the way that I treated people in this, I expected good, but only evil came. In verse 27, now I'm this shattered, lonely mess. Only the jackals call me brother. Only ostriches come around. In chapter 31, in verse 1, Job declares that he made a covenant with his eyes not to gaze, not to leer and lust after a young woman. Now, Job is about to go through this section where he says in different ways, if I sinned, then punish me. But he starts off with this. Because Job understands that for most men, this is the highest form of temptation they will have. Now, the other one is trusting in money. In verse 24, he'll get to that, right? The other large temptation that'll have the most verses is trusting in money rather than the Lord. But he starts off with this first, as a demonstration of just how hard Job was trying to be righteous before the Lord. And then Job asks, what is the portion for the unjust? Is it not calamity? Is it not disaster? So why don't you see my ways? Why don't you see that I'm trying to be good? Why am I getting the portion that should be reserved for the unjust? In verses 5 through 22, we see a series of if-then statements from Job. The first one kind of gives us the pattern, verse 5 and 6, where Job says, if I have walked in falsehood, then let God weigh me with accurate scales, and he will know my integrity. So if I've done this, then do this. And they're always commensurate there. There's a pattern. We have this series of potential sins that Job should be searched for, and if he's found guilty, I'll gladly accept the punishment because I'll be wrong. Verse 23 forms the end of the if-then statements, and Job declares him innocent of all of this and says that I have not done any of these things. Why? Because I fear God. Now, what did he say in the previous chapter? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And he goes, I fear God. Verse 24, Job is asking God to search his heart, to see if I trusted gold more than I trusted you. Verse 29, check my heart regarding an enemy or a stranger. Did I try to beat them down even when I had the advantage? Verse 33 is really interesting. This event is so close to the Garden of Eden that Job uses Adam like a commonly used metaphor for concealing sin. Have I covered my transgressions like Adam? This seems to be the only other biblical reference that Job makes in the book of Job. He's not talking about Moses. He's not even talking about Abraham. He talks about Adam. Verse 34, did I fear the opinion of the crowd? Did I fail to be bold for what is right? Verse 35 through 40, that's the final statement. Verse 35 is like he's signing an affidavit. Behold, here is my signature. Let the Almighty answer me. Now, he's going to start to get pretty snotty if we're being honest. But we need to understand that in a large way, he's been pushed here. He has dealt with round after round of accusation, but something about that last round of accusations from Eliphaz, where it says, and you did this and you did that. Something almost seems to break inside of Job, and he goes, that's it. I'm done. I'm going to prove my point. He says, I will declare to God himself the number of my steps. I'll tell him about my life. Not wise, but this is how worked up he is. Verse 38 through 40, he declares over himself a curse. If the land can even confess or testify of my wickedness. And in verse 40, Job rests his case, for the words of Job are at an end. This is where we're going to stop today. At this point of exhaustion, after all these rounds, all these words, all that Job has had to deal with, this is where we're going to end. Because this is the perfect place for us to understand the great lesson of Job and why we study him and we love him the way that we do. Because the great lesson of Job is not, where is God when I cry? And it's not even what we'll see next week. But the great lesson for us, for the one who loves the Lord and find themselves in a season of pain, is the wisdom that Job lives his life by. When I run into what I don't know, I fall back on what I do know. And what we do know is that our God is good. Mr. Pedro, if you would, sir.